So I want to begin by indulging in an exercise. I want everyone, if they will, to close their eyes. Right? So everyone close their eyes. Some of you have them open. Okay. So this is not a trick question. I'm just going to ask you something very straightforward. Raise your hand if you think it's fair to say that Pakistan is a part of the Middle East. Okay. Come on, put them higher. There we go.
Can you repeat the question?
Raise your hand if you think it's fair to say that Pakistan is a part of the Middle East. It's a really straightforward question. Okay. Now raise your hand if you think Pakistan is a part of South Asia. Raise your hand if you think it could be both. Okay, so that's some surprising results. And the reason I asked this is because in 2006, Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Peters, he published this map called Blood Borders. And so this is his idea of what a better Middle East would look like. And he wrote this in the Armed Forces Journal, and he gave a lot of reasoning. But there's kind of two sentences to go to Pakistan. And so he just kind of divided up Pakistan, said this would be better for the Balochi minorities, and that was that. And I think this is a really interesting signifier that, for me, growing up in post-9/11 Alberta, this idea has been exposed to me ubiquitously that Pakistan is a part of the Middle East, you're Middle Eastern, you're quasi-Arab, so on and so forth, which coming to university was kind of a shock. So I decided to investigate why that is and why this question matters. Oops, how do you go back? But the basic thesis of my presentation is that geographic imaginations are in fact often imaginations of civilizational difference, and that geographic language is in fact often racial language. So Brian Whittaker, who's a journalist, he said, "I've been writing about it in The Guardian for almost 4 years, and I'm fairly sure I've been there, but I have to confess I don't know for certain where the Middle East is." So this is a map that Karen Kosaki published of countries that are frequently associated with the Middle East. And as you go further and further out, Pakistan is finally included, but it's not usually included. So, what changed this? What precipitated a country being South Asian to being considered Middle Eastern? So, our modern conception of what is regarded as the Middle East comes from two men. One is Thomas Gordon, and one is Captain Alfred Mahan. And this was during the colonial period. And the Middle East was broadly referred to Persia, Mesopotamia, Afghanistan. But what I find interesting is that it was India was considered part of the Middle East back then, and it was very, very vague. They didn't have any actual set borders. There was a lot of anxiety around what the Middle East was and this idea of the Middle Eastern question. So it was a term born out of imperial anxiety, colonialism, and from the outside it was actually very, very vague. Another person who I couldn't find a picture of was a journalist by the name of Valentin Chirol, and he helped popularize this term, the Middle East, when he would write articles in British newspapers. Again, it was a travelogue from Persia to India, and it was very derogatory about the so-called Middle East, about Arabs, about Persians, about Indians. So not only has the term always revolved around racism and raciality, but also around a kind of imperial anxiety. So the term really got popular in the U.S. It used to refer to the Near East around the Cold War, particularly around the Iranian hostage crisis, around the Lebanese civil war, around the oil crises, and so on and so forth. So from the beginning until modern day, again, anti-Americanism, colonialism, and this sense of dread has surrounded the Middle East. So what about Pakistan? How did Pakistan enter the picture? Well, after 9/11, there was an initiative led by Bush and Condoleezza Rice called the Greater Middle Eastern Initiative, and they expanded the idea of the Middle East from Turkey to Morocco to, of course, Pakistan and Afghanistan to combat what they viewed as growing extremism. And one of the interesting indicators about this change is that the Middle Eastern Institute in Washington, in around, I think, 2012, they actually set up a Center for Pakistan Studies. So some of the cultural reflections of this is, in the film Iron Man, the terrorists, they speak Urdu, the language of Pakistan, national language. And in games like Call of Duty, in Karachi, where I come from, they have Arabic written all over the walls. And of course, Pakistani is also a language referred to in comic books. That's not a real language, by the way. So again, after 9/11, there's this ubiquitous idea that Pakistan is part of the Middle East, and it corresponds to the war on terror. So a really rough idea would be, okay, we have this idea of the Middle East, this idea of anxiety, this idea of coloniality, then it's expanded and Pakistan's included in it, and then suddenly Pakistanis are Middle Eastern. It's simple as that. And that's why we have hate crimes, and that's why we have xenophobia, and that's why Pakistanis are targeted for Islamophobia. But what I want to challenge here today is that that notion is actually not that new. So this paper is from 1906, and back then South Asians were collectively referred to as Hindus, Hindoos. And I want to give some backdrop to why this was. So from the 1820s to the early 1900s is when we had mass migration of South Asians, particularly Punjabis, to US and Canada. And in 1911, due to the US Immigration Commission, it stated that South Asians were actually the least desirable of races to come to the US. And this was formalized in 1917 in the Asiatic Barred Zone, which actually prevented South Asians and East Asians from coming to the US. And then in 1923, there was a case in which naturalized citizens from South Asia were actually, their citizenship was taken away. And this wasn't reversed until 1946, but even then we had quotas of how many Indians and South Asians could come. And then finally in 1965, this was reversed. So there's a long history, and this was spoken about earlier, of Asian exclusion. Fuck, I did it again. So these are some of the words in the actual formal document referring to people who are barred from coming to America. So you can see here, idiots, insane persons, alcoholics, homosexuals, polygamists, anarchists, and to be fair, like I actually would hang out with a lot of these people, but this was the kind of the imagery of South Asians and what they conjured up. And so one of the reasons that South Asians were feared at this time was rhetoric that they would steal our jobs, that they would infiltrate us with their culture. A lot of them were feared to be anarchist terrorists because of anti-colonial resistance in India. And in doing my research for this, I found what was interesting was a lot of the South Asians who were mobilizing against the British Raj in the Bay Area, they would argue that actually we're a lot like you Americans. We're fighting to free ourselves from British imperialism. But the U.S. ended up cooperating with the British Secret Service to oust them. So it's an example of the shared interests of both white supremacy and imperialism. So what were the other images of South Asians aside from, fearing them, hate crimes? Well, one of the most prevalent one was of swamis or yogis, these kind of mystical men who were often white men in brownface. So one example is Pierre Bernard, who was Om the Magnificent. Another example is Mr. Atkinson, who went by the name of Yogi Ramacharaka. And actual South Asian swamis and yogis were accepted. So again, the East was seen as this mystical place in contrast to Western rationality that we could learn things from. Another prominent example of the Orient was the circuses and vaudeville acts, where South Asian men in particular were seen to be feminized and emasculated, often also depicted as circus acts and freaks. And there was another side I didn't show here because the image was actually quite not suitable for work, but so another prominent example of this imagery would be of white women in brownface playing belly dancers and sexualized Eastern women. So the actual South Asians were undesirable and unaccepted, and the desirable South Asians were all these kind of caricatures. But not much has actually changed in the modern day. So we have people like Dr. Oz, who's Middle Eastern, to Deepak Chopra, who's Indian, and they're routinely popularized as these wise men giving these kind of spiritual or homeopathic knowledge, which actually doesn't end up meaning anything. And with examples like Eat, Pray, Love, we have the Westerner going to India to discover themselves because again, us Easterners are mystical. That's a service we provide. So thank you. Come again. An example of the feminized and emasculated Indian man still continues from everything to Apu to Raj. Again, they're not really sexual creatures. They're kind of nerds or givers of wisdom and so on and so forth. And as for examples of the sexualization of Middle Eastern Indian women, I don't know where to start with that. So I want to talk about a tangent that's kind of related to this, is that there's been a lot of discussion about cultural appropriation in the context of the bindi and henna and belly dancing and things like that. And I'm not going to go into discussion of whether I think that's right or wrong, But what I find fascinating is that more often than not, it is white women who are donning these apparels to feel more exotic and to feel more sexual. And this actually goes back to that history I talked about, where images of the East were seen as sensual, erotic, timeless, as opposed to Western rationality. So there's a direct line from this all the way to the previous South Asian immigration histories. What does that mean for Pakistanis, and why does that have to do with Pakistan? So on the one hand, we have undesirable South Asians, right? Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, who are now coded as Middle Eastern. And on the other hand, we have desirable South Asians, which are typically Indians, North Indians, who are tokenized in the form of the effeminate man, the nerd, the yogi, the wise man, the sexualized woman. And if you see people, this is Nikki Hill and Governor Bobby Jindal, who are prominent Indian politicians in the South, they use the most conservative, Islamophobic rhetoric in their speeches, but they're actually widely accepted, right? So now we have Indians who are still tokenized, and all these images are still racist, but to an extent they are accepted, whereas instead Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, and oftentimes Sikhs are the victims of hate crimes. Following 9/11, there was a program called the NCEERS program, in which people from Oman, Sudan, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Libya, there's too many countries to list, were all deported. About 10,000 people, mostly men, ended up being deported. And the only commonality between these countries was not language or ethnicity, but in fact religion. And I bring this up because I mentioned the early South Asians who were barred from immigration. This list also included Arabs. But Syrian Christian Arabs, in almost every single case in the United States, they were accepted entry, right? And I was reading the court cases of why this was, and one of the reasons was because many of them were white passing, but a lot of them, it was explicitly known that it was because they were Christian, which meant that they were compatible with Western culture. So the consequences for this undesirable brown versus the desirable brown means complacency of things like the drone war in Afghanistan and Pakistan. It means the rising mental health issues within young Muslims, particularly Pakistani Muslims. And it means that there's a ubiquitous idea that I'm Middle Eastern, my family's Middle Eastern, and Bollywood and Mehndis and henna, things that are part of my culture, are actually part of someone else. So aside from hate crimes and mental health, this actually divides the South Asian community. And I want to note that these geographies, they're not natural. They're not just kind of there. They're constructed, and there's a very clear history of how they've been constructed. But this history goes back hundreds of years, right? It's not just 9/11. It's not just Trump. It's not just recent xenophobia. It's been like this for a very long time, and it would take a really long time to undo. Thank you.